Welcome, everyone, to Historical Faith Society's sort of conclusion of From Tablets to Torah Scrolls. And I'm happy to have Dr. Peter van der Veen with us, coming in from Germany, and Dr. Scott Stripling from another country called Texas. Well, welcome, gentlemen, and we are excited to have the audience with us today. And really, it's been a great discussion. We've looked at a number of different things, and I don't know, Scott. I think that the discoveries at Mount Ebal. I know that there's more exciting things coming, but this is probably one of the biggest, I believe. To what scale do you think, and if people aren't quite familiar, I think they should be by this past month, but with this Mount Ebal inscription, it's big. It really brings a lot of things into focus, doesn't it?
Well, assuming that we're right on our reading of it, the relevance of it, then on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 10. It just moves the ball a lot in the areas of biblical studies, archaeology, our understanding of the emergence of early Israel, things that have been very controversial, and that we have tried to engage in that arena of ideas in a professional and an academic manner. I think this tilts the scales a bit in the direction of the early date of the Exodus, or what many call the biblical date of the Exodus and conquest.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's very exciting because the object is so small. And just to notice that there is so much writing on it, and this writing is so minuscule. This tells you something about the ability of the scribe. It's not somebody who's just been trying to write something. It's somebody who knew very well what he was doing. And knowing that this is an Israelite inscription naming the God of Israel, Yahweh, I think it just shows that writing traditions were very early in ancient Israel.
Yeah, just as the Bible, I think, was communicating, because we know that the commandment was to write these. It was a commandment to write these commandments on your doorposts of your home and teach them to your children. So that, in my understanding, was letting us know that the Israelites were supposed to use writing as a way to communicate who God was to their children. So it's a pretty big idea. We've got a question here.
When you write it, it makes it real. Just like God told Ezekiel later, hear the words of the prophecy, write them down. It's when they're written down that they become binding, that they have force. And in the ancient world, that was incredibly important to them. And the fact that the tablet was then sealed is what brought it into force, and then laid on the altar. So the symbolism is pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. I just want everyone to know that as you're watching this chat, as you're watching this program, you can actually ask questions of the scholars, and that's the purpose of these events. And we do have a question coming up, but over on the side, you see a chat. If you want to open your screen up large enough, you'll see a place where you can write in the chat side, and you can write questions. We're going to go through those to give answers. So Thomas Donlan has a question. The discovery of this curse tablet with its juxtaposition of Yahweh and El means Bible believers will have less to fear from the arguments of the documentary hypothesis. What are your thoughts on that?
Peter, you want to take that?
Sure. According to documentary hypothesis, the earliest source is that of the Yahwist in the 10th, 9th centuries BC, the Elohist 8th century, and so on. But now we have an inscription here that goes back at least to the 14th century BC, where we have both El and Yahweh together in one inscription, showing that actually these names are just different names for the same God, the God of Israel, belonging together with a common source. And I think this is very powerful evidence against the documentary hypothesis.
Yeah, I remember when I first became aware that we had El and Yahweh juxtaposed. I just couldn't. It was overwhelming. I don't think I slept for days because the ramifications are so huge. When we've been beaten over the head with this documentary hypothesis, and that this is not possible, and that we're all simpletons. When of course we knew that wasn't the case, and here we have evidence that indeed it is not. And really, let me say this: this is how you differentiate Canaanite from Hebrew, because they're using the same script. It's only when you have uniquely religious words that would only be Canaanite or only be Israelite that we can say for sure. Say, for example, we've got new inscriptions from Lachish. You know, it's hard to say for sure whether it's Canaanite or Hebrew. We have a gut feeling, but we can't be positive. But here we have, there's only one group of people worshiping Yahweh in the ancient world, and those are Israelites. And here we have Yahweh El. So it's just phenomenal.
You know, I had the opportunity to go meet Israel Finkelstein, and I went to Tel Aviv, and we were talking about, and his theory is that the Israelites were always there. In other words, the whole idea that they never really conquered the land, but they were always there. But as I looked at the issue of the conquest, I said, well, according to the scriptures, the Israelites are going to move into a land that they don't have to build the cities. They're going to take over places that are there. And that's what the scripture tells us. But I never thought about the way to distinguish this was from the God. And that absolutely makes all the sense in the world. So that's a really important point, that the Yahweh is it that understanding then really is a defining marker. Have there been any other names of Yahweh that we've seen before this, or is this the earliest?
Can I answer? I mean, this is debatable, perhaps, but we may have a rather early reference to Yahweh at Sirabet al-Khadim in southwestern Sinai. There is a chief of the retinue with his two sons, and these people are mentioned on a small obelisk that is currently kept at the British Museum in London. And one of the sons' name is Ya-Na'am. The name has been read by a professional Egyptologist, Thomas Schneider, who gives different possibilities how to read this name. But one possibility is to read Yah as divine name for Yahweh, and Na'am is utterance or spoken word of Yahweh. The context of these people is something like Midianite, Canaanite, related to Israelites. So it's possible that we have a rather early reference, and this would be about datable to 1800 BC.
And then, of course, we have the Solon Hieroglyph, that is from the reign of Amenhotep III, and there you have a clear reference to Yahweh, the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. So if people are believing that there was not an Israelite entrance into the land until, say, the 13th century, that's very problematic, because you've got a 14th century, mid-14th century inscription to the time of Amenhotep III referring to the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. So there's people who worship Yahweh and they live in a land. At that point.
I would like to answer this. I've been working since 2006 on an inscription, the so-called Israel pedestal relief at the Berlin Museum, and the Egyptians refer to a group of people called Israel in an archaic form within Canaan, but separated from Canaan. You have actually three names. It says Askelon, it says Canaan, and it says Israel. Now, if you take Israel Finkelstein theory on this, the Egyptians shouldn't be separating Canaan and Israel because it would be one and the same thing. I also published an article this year in an Egyptological book where I show that even 3 other tribes of Israel, Reuben, Issachar, and Asher, are already mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions from the 14th and 13th centuries BC, showing that these groups had already moved into the country, and they are clearly separated from the Canaanites.
Well, that's important.
To build on that, Tim, I cited Peter's work on the Berlin pedestal, just phenomenal. I cited that several places in 5 Views on the Exodus, Zondervan's recent work, which is a pretty hot-selling book. And the other 4 authors had an opportunity to rebut my arguments, which they did, and then I was able to counter those. So it's a great tool, but nobody took on that argument. I put Peter's research out there on the Berlin pedestal, and none of the other scholars refuted it. But if it's right, then their positions couldn't possibly be correct, but they had nothing to say.
Yeah, and I think sometimes what ends up happening is that they don't bring it up. So it's an uncomfortable subject, right? Thomas has another one. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll. 24, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever. Job 19, 23, and 4. And then Thomas writes, was there a period of time early that these writings in lead were used? Does this help argue for an early date of the book of Job?
Thomas is very perceptive. He's very perceptive. The thing is, we know Job 19:25 well, those of us who are Bible readers, because it's the earliest mention of resurrection. But right before it, you have this statement about writing on lead with a pen. I'll just say this, that we did recover 2 styluses from Mount Ebal. And we'll be publishing those. We mentioned them in the first article. We'll be publishing more about them in the second article. But it is very early, and I think Thomas is right. But I'm sure Peter has something more technical to say.
Yeah. I think we do have evidence that writing in lead was likely not the standard thing, but it was certainly used at a rather early age. The earliest known lead inscription was actually found at the Hittite capital in Anatolia, modern Turkey, from the 14th, 13th century BC, where also the Hittites used lead to write something that was supposed to survive. We have several more inscriptions which date from the early 1st millennium BC, but they are not the earliest. The earliest we know is definitely from the Hittite capital, from the late Bronze Age, which would just basically coincide with this inscription from Mount Ebal.
One of the interesting things, Peter, about the lead is that with modern chemical analysis, we can determine what mine the lead came from. And in this case, we were able to do analysis on the lead and determine that it came from a mine in Lavrion, Greece. And we know already, because there's a lot of published material on this, when that mine was in usage. So we know that it was in use at the time that we're identifying this as early 14th century. And we also know that exports from Europe or Anatolia, let's say, into the southern Levant ceased around the year 1200. All archaeologists agree on that. So if you do the math, then we've got a lead source from Lavrion, Greece that was in use during the late Bronze Age period, and we know that exports stopped. So therefore, it's very likely that this predates 1200 and confirms the epigraphy to early 14th century BC, most likely.
And it confirms the archaeology. Because we have nothing later than 1200 or at the latest 1150, but there is nothing later than early Iron Age at the site.
Klaus Bartels has a question. Is it true that Palestine administration deconstructs the altar on Mount Ebal for gaining material?
No, not to my knowledge. They have done some destruction to the outer perimeter wall of the foot-shaped enclosure, but I think they were grinding it up into caliche for road paving. But the altar itself has been damaged, but not for secondary usage.
Okay. We're looking. People are thanking us. We've got a YouTube audience that's on as well, and that's growing. Hey, Logan, why don't you throw up what the inscription actually looks like again? Let's look. Let's look at some of this artwork and just talk about it, if you can. It's going to be putting that up. All of a sudden,
while Logan's putting that up there, let me tell you, we have received phenomenal feedback from social media people on the quality of this 6-part presentation, Tim, that you've put together. There's so much that's out there in social media these days. People are posting stuff, and this has clearly been a cut above.
Well, we can thank Logan, too, for helping that and the material. Yeah. It's so important. And I think that one thing that we do know is that this material is really, really important. That's why we want to take and make it as professional as we can. We've got a question from Jeffrey. Jeffrey says, does the script on the lead tablet support Dr. Douglas Petrovich's theory that Hebrew is the oldest alphabetic script?
Peter?
Anyone want to take that?
Well, I would be a little bit careful with that. The question, of course, is what do you mean by Hebrew script? I think the original Hebrew was probably something I would tend to call Amorite, because the patriarchs, they descended into Canaan from an area near Haran in northern Syria, and the language spoken by these people was Amorite. That was the Amorite region, Balich Haran region. And interestingly, in the book of Genesis, Abraham is just communicating with the people, the Amorites of the land. I think, yes, we can actually say Hebrew is as much a dialect that belongs to the Amorite group, West Semitic group, so to say. But as far as the date of this material, Dr. Petrovich refers to the inscriptions at Sirbet al-Khadim. But at the moment, we are actually perhaps even having earlier inscriptions that were found near Aleppo, which date back to the early Bronze Fall period, which would be about the time, as we understand it, the time of Abraham. And this means that in central Syria, they were already using a proto-alphabetic script. So even there, we can say the patriarchs, it's nothing unusual for the patriarchs to also use this script to actually write portions of what we know today as the book of Genesis. So it's difficult. I mean, we have a lot more to say about proto-alphabetic script when we come to southwestern Sinai. We have the Wadi El Chol. We have at Ilahun in Egypt. We have proto-alphabetic inscriptions from the time, what we believe is the time when the Israelites came to Egypt toward the end of the 12th dynasty. But this is archaeology. You never know what we will be discovering tomorrow, yes? And one of those chance finds were indeed these 4 small cylinders found near Aleppo with an even earlier form of proto-alphabetic.
Yeah, well, what date would that be around then?
Well, around... If you want a very round number, something like 2000 BC, matching the date of the biblical patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac.
And to give you an analogy, and I think generally speaking, Joseph's question, Doug Petrovich is generally speaking correct, and there's maybe different nuances that we could identify. But if you think about it, say Abraham, that's analogous to Old English for our English-speaking audience. Then we have Middle English, which is like Chaucer, and that's sort of analogous to Paleo-Hebrew, Biblical Hebrew. And then we have Modern Hebrew, which would be analogous to modern English. So someone who speaks modern English would have a very difficult time with Old English reading that. So they are related, but they're also quite distinct. What we have on the Mount Ebal tablet is this proto-alphabetic script. And so it's clearly from an older period than Paleo-Hebrew.
Yeah,
much agreed. Yes,
we wanted to put up some imagery, but the program's not allowing us to put it in there yet. So we're going to just keep talking here. Mark Bergen has a question. Bergen, what is the leading theory on who the Mount Ebal amulet was written to? What possible context do scholars think may surround it? Any ideas?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what my theory was, and I think Peter has agreed, and we'll publish it, and then there'll probably be a million theories after that. For now, all I know is what our theory is. It was written by an individual as a titular head on behalf of the early nation of Israel as a confirmation or a summation of the curses of Deuteronomy, the covenant renewal ceremony. And it was written, and then it was laid on the altar there. So that's our view right now, and it'll be interesting to see what other views emerge.
Mm-hmm. So the person who wrote, excuse me,
no, Peter,
the person who wrote the inscription. Yeah, the person who wrote this inscription was likely a priest, I would imagine. So he was a Levite, and now the question is it related to an individual who has not observed the law code of Moses? We tend to believe it's a more general thing. It's relating to the people of Israel. It was put on the altar, asking God for forgiveness for committed sins, asking God to be gracious. And but, we can't know exactly because there is nobody referred to in the inscription who is actually addressed. So, yeah.
Right. But it is self-imprecatory. So either it's Israelites bringing upon themselves a self-imprecatory oath, which is not surprising, or it's a curse possibly on the nations around them. That's also known in the Torah itself. Now, if other tablets were to emerge from the remaining portion of material, then I might change my mind and say that, okay, these were individual curses. But for what we see right now, I think it's more likely that it's a corporate self-imprecatory oath.
Mm-hmm. Just for a moment, let's pause and just say, at Mount Ebal, for people who don't know, and Gerizim, let's set the context of what happened there, because there was a covenant made, correct, at the mountain when Joshua came in. So there was a covenant made at Mount Sinai, and previously this location, which some people might not realize, was where Jacob and his family were. And this is where Abraham had come earlier. This is a hot zone for biblical activity, right? It's possible that Abraham had sacrificed in that area. Jacob had lived in that.
Well, it's not only possible, it's certain. You have the Abrahamic covenant is cut there at El Moreh. So the next hill over, and I think that's why Moses tells them to go back to that spot. They're going to renew the Abrahamic covenant there.
And then then Jacob lived in that area. And Joseph's bones then were brought back to the area, right? I mean, it's all within walking. I mean, it's just very close. And then you've got this valley with these two mountains that are side by side, and the blessings, half the tribes were on one side and half the tribes were on the other side. So 6 tribes, and they were repeating the blessings and the curses. And is this altar on which side of which mountain? It's Mount Ebal. So was that the curse mountain or was that the blessing mountain? That was
Peter?
Ebal.
As is stated in Deuteronomy 27, blessing was to be spoken on Mount Gerizim, and curses were to be spoken on Mount Ebal. So, and this is where we find the curse tablet. It's right on the mountain where curses were to be spoken. Blessing was related to Israel when it abided by the law of Moses, and if they were to move away from it, transgress against God's law, there would be curse. And this is the context.
Yeah, and this is a huge historical thread that I'm following too with our films, because it will lead to the destruction of the temple twice. Thomas Donlan has another question. It says, wet sifting, does this create an interest in doing more wet sifting? Well, I think we know what the answer is, but, and is there more material that could really benefit from wet sifting? Are you excited about going, hey, maybe we need to take another look at a few more areas?
Yeah, well, Thomas, once again, is perceptive. Let me, before I respond to that, say a word about the blessings and curses. Your viewers may find this interesting. There's a temple on Mount Gerizim, which is built during the Hasmonean period. So you have a priest, I believe his name is Jonathan. I have to look it up to be certain. But anyway, he marries a Samaritan woman, and he's ostracized from the priesthood in Jerusalem. So his Samaritan father-in-law builds him his own temple on Mount Gerizim, which is a replica of Zerubbabel's temple. So if you want to understand what did the second temple look like, rededicated in 516 BC, Zerubbabel's temple, because nothing of it remains, of course. We can go to Mount Gerizim and we can see, because it was built on the same blueprint and it's there today. So they would have never built a temple on the mountain of the curse. They built it on the mountain of the blessing. And so the blessings come from Gerizim, the curses from Ebal. And then Moses' point is, behold, this day I set before you life and death. Choose life. Choose Mount Gerizim over Mount Ebal. But when you do sin, you have an altar on Mount Ebal to expiate that sin. In response to Thomas's question, yes, we are huge advocates of wet sifting. And if no one has ever seen our operation at Shiloh, I invite them to come and see it. It's quite the operation. We wet sift 100% of the material, and I'm strongly advocating to my colleagues in the archaeological community that they do the same. And I wish that we would have a large donor, a philanthropist who would step forward and say, let's create a large fund for people, because people tell me we can't afford to wet sift. It costs money to do this. I wish that we had somebody who would say, okay, let's endow this fund and enable those who want to convert and bring in this new technology to be able to do it. We've simply got to slow down, in my opinion, and be a little more thorough with the wet sifting process. If not, we're losing evidence like this.
Yes. Benjamin, I'm going to jump around to some different questions because we're right on the subject here. Was with this tablet was made, Benjamin Scholl says, if the tablet was made of lead, melting temperature of lead is only 327 degrees Celsius, shouldn't it have melted when any sacrifice was burned on the altar afterwards? The lead tablet was put there. So I guess it might depend where it was put, correct? Near the altar, or was it on the altar? Was it in the altar? Anyone want to take a question? Yeah.
Yeah, well, we don't know exactly where it was because we recovered it from the dump pile, but we know that dump pile came from the altar area. I think it was probably put on the altar after the sacrifice, and indeed it may have reshaped or become malleable again when it got hot. But that was only a one-time ceremony that was done in Joshua's day. Then that area was then covered in with bone material during the 13th century altar, when the rectangular altar was in use. So I think the tablet was already lower down at that point.
Okay, so that's something new I didn't know about. You're saying that over the centuries there was more than one altar, it might have been rebuilt?
Right. So you have a round altar that dates to the LB1B, LB2A horizon around 1400, let's say. And then you have a larger rectangular altar during the period of the Judges that is built over that. And 97% of the material that you find at Mount Ebal comes from that later rectangular altar that is on top of, it protects, it venerates the earlier altar. Our curse tablet does not date to the later rectangular altar. It dates to the earlier round altar.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple other questions. This one is a little bit different. It says, do you think there's any crossover of knowledge gained by the three wise men and the Zadok priests in order to foresee Jesus as the Messiah?
I insist that Peter answer that one.
I was just wondering how this was related to Mount Ebal. But it's certainly...
I didn't want to take the opportunity around this Christmas time to get the three wise men input.
Yeah, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, if it says, do you think there was a crossover of knowledge gained by the three wise men and the Zadok priests in order for them to foresee Jesus as the Messiah?
So a lot of things have been suggested in this direction. The problem with the wise men is that we don't know 100% where they came from. Yeah, I suppose they came from the Parthian kingdom, which is Western Iran, Mesopotamia. Yes. Yes, I mean, what we do know from this area is that a lot of Jewish people who did not return to the Holy Land, they stayed in the diaspora, and we know of Jews who stayed in Babylon and in Persia. And that's the place where the wise men would have come from. So maybe they knew from the Jewish citizens of their area that a Messiah was to come. And as they were very informed astrologists who knew very well to interpret star constellations, the combination of stars that were seen at that time, supposedly 7 or 6 BC, the year when Jesus was born, would have shown that the king that was born, who was a divine king, was born in the area of Syria, Israel. And that's why, of course, they went first to Herod, because Herod was the king of the area. So, yes, they knew how to interpret the star constellation. But I suppose, yes, they may have well been informed about a coming Messiah by the Jewish citizens of the area where they came from. Now, whether that is related to Sadducite priests, I believe that's a possibility. But I think, yes, some religious folk living in the diaspora may have shared this idea. And, I mean, let's think of Daniel, the book of Daniel. There are clear prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, the Son of Man. Jesus called himself the Son of Man. He refers clearly to Daniel 7 as that he is the one that was prophesied. So, yeah, I think there are some connections between Babylon, Persia, and the birth of Christ. Yes.
But let me add that the Zadokite priesthood had ended by that point. So the Hasmoneans did something that was unthinkable. They combined the office of king and priest. And when they did that, they ended the Zadokite priesthood and they made themselves the priests. And this is why the Essenes formed, the group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They formed out of protest for that. This was no longer biblical Judaism in their view. The separation of powers that we know of today, like legislative, executive, and judicial, that comes from the Bible. And so the king is separate from the priest is separate from the prophet. And when they made themselves king and priest, then this was a big problem, and that ended. So his question was, would the wise men have been influenced by the Zadokite priesthood, or were they communicating? There was no Zadokite priesthood to communicate with at that point.
Yeah. Actually, I would add to that. The people who saw, the religious movement at the time of Jesus, who saw themselves as Zadokites, were the Sadducees. And the Sadducees actually only accepted the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, as the word of God. So they did not even accept any prophecies relating to the birth of Christ in the book of Isaiah, in Daniel. They just accepted the books of Moses, and that was it. So actually, it's even unlikely that there would be any religious Sadducite association.
With maybe one exception, the Numbers 24 prophecy. So you've got Numbers 24, 17 to 19. You know, a star is going to rise. True. And of course, that's what the Magi were following, was the star. So we're a little off topic, but it's very interesting since it's Christmas season.
But what's true? That was our special feature there for the Christmas season. But I have a question for you too. We've got one other question here that we're going to ask about Joseph. But before we do, let's talk about a generation. Just curious, because as I try to look at things visually, I try to visualize. We made the wall of time in our films, which I think helped to see where things were. How long is a generation? What would be a definition of a generation for you? That's my question, because I want to give a perspective to this. So, Peter, you get the honor to start. What is the definition of a generation?
Well, depends what you mean. If you're talking about the Hebrew word dor, which is a lifespan, then this is a different thing. I think you have a reference to 4 generations in Genesis 15. After 4 generations, the descendants of Abraham will be returning to the land, the promised land. This may be slightly longer lifespan. I've done quite some study on this, and there is actually a section on this in our English book on the patriarchs, which has recently come out, In Search of the Biblical Patriarchs. I compare this with information we got from Mesopotamia, and there the duru is actually something like 60 to 70 years. As a lifespan. If you talk strictly about a generation, how scholars interpret the generation, then an average generation that is based on a lot of material that comes from genealogies, which we have in Egypt, we have in the Bible, and so on, then a generation is something very near to 25 years. It's very difficult because parenthood started much earlier in this part of the world in biblical times. In Egypt, a 16-year-old young man would marry a girl of 13, 14 years, and she would be pregnant if she's maybe when she was 14. So this already minimizes the length of a generation. But then again, based on genealogies, you never know exactly if the generation passes from the firstborn to the next firstborn. So on an average, anything between 20 and 25 years is the standard estimate used by most scholars.
Right. I'll show you something. If you take the 3,500 by 70 years, we're only 50 lifespans away from these events. Now, when I think of it that way, now, if you think of it the other way and you said, well, 3,500 divided by 25, it gives you 140. So the 140 away. So 140, I mean, this sounds like a long time ago, but do you realize that, if I had this, like, how do I visualize this? But, you get on a regular airplane that's just an average airplane, and there's 140 people on that. Those people, 140 people in a congregation is kind of a small congregation, but you can see them quite easily. What it's hard to believe, and what's interesting is that I was in New York with the Orthodox Chabad, and there's one family there that they knew the names of all their ancestors. They memorized them all the way back to the time of the Exodus, and they would teach them to their children so they could say my grandfather, my great grandfather, and they would go all the way back to the time. And why do I say that is that we think of these things happen a long time ago, but these events are not as long ago in the grand scheme of God's plan. This is relatively, short as you look at I am that I am, And so there's sort of an internal look to things. So, hey, need some more questions from our audience out there. We've got one here about Joseph, and we talked about this is a time of being a Messiah, being a Savior. Joseph, the question is, if we think about Joseph, and in many ways, he had this calling on his life, and no one understood it. And then he's sold into slavery, and he suffers, and he's somewhat like a savior to the people of his people, right? Because of his life, because what he went through, he's sort of a foreshadowing of a savior type figure. But I don't know, maybe I'm overinterpreting it. The question that Thomas has is, how politically difficult would it be to attempt DNA analysis of the bones that might be left of Joseph? Now, the question also is, I'm not sure if anyone's ever even gone looking for those bones or if there's any bones there to look for. Does anyone know? And we're talking about the tomb of Joseph in Nablus.
Well, what we have at the tomb in Nablus, and I've been there many times, is a cenotaph. It's a false tomb or false sarcophagus, a memorial sarcophagus. Whether there's something that's underneath there, you have the same thing, of course, at Machpelah in Hebron. You have these cenotaphs, but there are caves underneath there that do have actual burials. I don't know if that's the case at Nablus, because to my knowledge, no exploration has been done underneath there. Of course, that would be a very sensitive thing to do. So if we did recover bones, we could test them for DNA. That's a hot new thing in archaeology.
Yeah. I would actually start with material at Tel Aviv. It's really toward the end of the 12th dynasty that Western Asiatic people are moving into Egypt, exactly there where the Bible says that's where the Israelites lived. And I would presume that the earliest folk living there very likely would be the Israelites. Now, naturally, at a later stage, other people would be joining them. And at the time of the Exodus, there is a reference to a mixed multitude. So there were other Asiatics that were moving out of Egypt with the Israelites. But at the very early stage, I would suggest this is Jacob and his sons. And so maybe we would have a better chance finding some DNA there if the authorities in Egypt would allow these bones to be taken, which is very questionable. Yes, especially if this were for.
Yeah, Manfred Bitek actually uncovered those Asiatic people laying in a Asiatic burial. They were on their side with. And they really represented, if you look at the film, The Patterns of Evidence Exodus, you'll see what they look like. We got that photography from Manfred Bitek's organization. But going back to DNA, I'm trying to think, it was Dr. Skorecki. from Haifa. I met with him, and he did a test on rabbis because they had all these people that said they were Kohanim. They were descendants, but they looked very different from each other. And so they did a test, and they found out that they were related. They published it in a scientific journal. So that's something you guys could look up, Dr. Skrecki's DNA test on Kohanim. And it's fascinating what you can learn from that. Jeffrey has a question going back to this area and this altar. It says, has there been any attempting to find any writing on the plaster that Dr. Zerdahl found at the altar on Mount Ebal?
Yes. Very recently, Scheibar, who is concluding Zerdahl's work on Mount Ebal and publishing it, does have that plaster, and he told me that he is intending to examine it very closely under infrared and ultraviolet lighting, for example, and to see if there is writing on it.
Good.
But it remains unpublished at this point.
Where was that plaster? Was it up on top of the mountain there, or
near in the altar area, in the actual excavation of that? To just remind folks, what Zerdahl encountered was a mantle. The altar had been intentionally buried. So once he removed that blanket of stone, that mantle he called it, then you had the rectangular altar emerged, the round altar was underneath it. So in then the process of excavating the rectangular altar is where he began to recover plaster. So it was all throughout the excavation. They got fragments, some of it with flat surfaces on it. So it will be very interesting to see if there is writing on that and it, for example, matches, it's proto-alphabetic, like our tablet. That would be very, very important.
Michael Beard asks, do you have any indication of when your article on the Ebal artifact will be published?
Yeah, we're impatiently waiting. The 26th of this month will be 4 months that it's been in peer review. So at that point, I think I'm going to rent a hotel room across from their offices and start knocking on their door every day. These things can take a long time, and quite frankly, there aren't that many experts in this area that are out there, and we're waiting. We're almost 4 months into the process now.
Yeah, I may add to this that some of the real top epigraphers, I communicated with them, and they said they wouldn't even touch proto-alphabetic scripts because it's so difficult to interpret. And so this adds weight to what Scott just said. It's probably very difficult to find those people that could understand, can understand what we are talking about. Yes, it's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, because they need expertise in computer science. You've got three things going on. You've got computer science. That's a whole different area of expertise. You've got the archaeological aspect of it, and then you've got the epigraphical aspect of it. So, really they need three different qualified peer reviewers. But we're completely in the dark. We have no idea who these people are, and we're just waiting.
Yeah. Let's see here. Yes, Logan has a question about how could you help the audience understand the archaeological context from Mount Ebal that helps date the Course Tablet to the time of Joshua? Is there what's the overall idea of that?
Let me talk about the pottery, and Peter, you can talk about the glyptic finds. The pottery is very clearly from the about 3% of it is late Bronze Age, and about 97% of it is Iron Age 1. And we know this through typology. So we compare the pottery from this site to many, many other sites, and there's an agreed upon typology. Strangely, I was in a meeting recently where two different scholars tried to make light of the 3% of late Bronze Age pottery, forms that exist in 1400 that no longer exist in 1300, to put it in layman's terms. And they just sort of dismiss that, offhandedly as, it can be odd sherds of pottery here and there. We can't base it on that. Well, that's, I don't think that's a fair way to deal with the material, just when it disagrees with your preconceptions that, well, we just throw it out. But unfortunately, we get the same thing with the scarabs. Peter can talk about that.
Yeah, we have actually 2 points here. The scarabs, actually, Adam Sertal discovered 2 scarabs and then also a seal. The seal is less clear. But the scarabs, yes, they were dated by Sertal's team to the 13th century. But this was rather surprising because one of the scarabs actually has the royal name of Pharaoh Thutmose III on it. Now, this does not mean it cannot be later. The name Thutmose III was used on also later scarabs because likely Thutmose III was the greatest pharaoh of all times. We talk about him as the Napoleon Bonaparte of Egyptian pharaonic history. But then the type of scarab, it has a cartouche, it has a bowman, it has a small gecko on it. It's a type that is clearly attested during the early first half of the 18th dynasty. Then there is another scarab. Stylistically, it's clearly within a context of the early 18th dynasty. And one colleague of mine, who has done also a lot of work on scarabs, Daphne Bento, has looked at these scarabs, and it was her conclusion as well. Yes, these are 18th dynasty scarabs. So whatever you make of the Iron Age pottery, most of the pottery is Iron Age, but we have scarabs here from the late Bronze Age. That's one thing, and they are likely from the LB1 to LB2A transition period, which is about 1400 BC or even slightly earlier. The scarabs are very early. Yeah. And then, of course, we have the script itself on the tablet. We have done a very careful study and comparison of the forms of the letters. We talk about the paleographic dates. There are diagnostic pegs that actually link the type of script to something that is common within this part of the world, the southern Levant, to the 15th and 14th century. If you look at other inscriptions dating later to about 1200, it's not that close anymore to what we find in this inscription. So it has the closest parallels to what we know from about the 15th, 14th centuries. So the script is likely 15th, 14th century. The scarabs are from that time. Then we have the pottery. Well, the pottery that is another point here. So, as I've been arguing since many, many years, is that you don't have a consecutive chronology in archaeology where Iron Age is followed by Iron Age follows after the late Bronze Age, as if there was a day 1 of Iron 1 after day 100 of late Bronze Age. No, this is very much related to forms in pottery which are regionally restricted. You have pottery types that scholars believe is typical of Iron 1, which could already occur during the 14th and 13th century, further away from the main trade routes in the hinterland of the country. It's partly a regional thing, and it's wrong to actually argue that Iron Age must definitely come after 1200. It could have started considerably earlier in the hinterland. Yes.
A question was, thank you, Peter.
Go
ahead, Scott.
Sertal himself talked about a type of pottery called Ainun pottery that was late Bronze Age in form, but Iron Age in wear. And so, it's not that we know everything about pottery, but we do have a consensus. For example, we're all using Sagatine's pottery books that were published a few years ago. So we have a number of forms, 7, I'll say, but 5 positively, that exist in the 1400s or around 1400. They no longer are in use anywhere in the year 1300. How did those forms get there? And it just so happens that they coincide with the paleographic date that Peter was talking about, the date of the lead coming out of Laverion as well. So suffice it to say, we're pretty comfortable with this date, approximately 1400 BC. It is problematic for those who take a late date, and so I think they will attempt to be dismissive with it. Some will, others will be, I'm sure, fair-minded about it.
Yeah. And the late date, meaning that the Exodus happened, there's what we would call a biblical date of 1440 or 1450 BC, and then there's the late date, which is the 1250 BC. And the late date is connected to Ramesses, the idea of the time of Ramesses, and the biblical date, which is a pointer, is 200 years earlier than that. Question from Sean is just a quick question, as we're coming down to the end here. Jericho, wasn't there issues with making light of pottery in Jericho as well? Does anyone have any comments on this issue there?
My real short answer is yes. Same problem, dismissing the scarabs. When the scarabs disagree with their presupposed chronology, they always make them commemorative. And there's no standard way to assess what is commemorative, what is not. So when they don't fit the chronology, they get thrown out as being commemorative.
Okay, but when they fit the chronology, they're a marker, I guess. No, the question asked is, what is a scarab? What is an Egyptian scarab? What was the purpose? But they're like a beetle, an artistic beetle. I mean, that's my interpretation of it. Now, what is yours?
Peter?
Yeah, okay. Most scarabs are made of a very soft stone, which is called steatite, and it's actually baked to make it hard. But because it's so soft, it's very easy to engrave. Now, not all scarabs are made of steatite. We also have Veen's scarabs made in a mold. All that is possible. It's actually it's a small amulet. Most scarabs were probably worn as amulets on a necklace, or as charms, simply as charms. Very few. Sometimes they have just simple signs, luck signs on them. Sometimes they have names on them, and even if they have a royal name, they can still be luck charms. We have much fewer scarabs that were actually used as seals by officials, royal officials, normally naming the official and his titulature. But in the past, about 100 years ago, they believed that all the scarabs were used as seals by officials until they found so many of them. They thought, well, everybody in that part of the world would have been an official. Probably not. Most of them were used as charms, and also there are a lot of charms, amulets in the form of a beetle, and the beetle was actually the sign of the regenerated solar deity, the god Ra. Were worn on a necklace, for instance, by women as a charm during childbirth, just hoping that she would have healthy children, and that's probably what it is. So we don't know what these scarabs at Mount Ebal were used for originally, but they're there, and they can be clearly dated. Yes.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time. Do you guys have time for one or two more questions, or do you need to go, Scott?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Fine too.
All right. Paul Favada, if I said that correctly. Paul, sorry. Paul's my middle name, by the way. How closely do various schools work together in processing and updating biblical thought? As an example, our understanding of sisterhood status and the use of teraphim from the Nuzi tablets. Does anyone know how to answer that question there? Our understanding of sisterhood status and the use of teraphim from the Nuzi tablets.
Well, the first part of the question was how closely do different schools work together? I'm not sure if those are separate questions, but if they are, we do collaborate. Okay, so for example, Peter has invited me to his conference in Germany next year, and I've invited him to our conference in the United States, and so we collaborate all the time with other scholars. And so we are trying to learn from each other, even people we disagree with quite a bit, where we can still learn a lot from them. But as far as the specifics of the second part of the question, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here's another question. Well, I heard somewhere that Manassites might have been up in their territory, now North Jordan. During the time of the Exodus, were they doing trade back and forth? May explain the hostility of Edom and Moab. Does that make any sense? If I'm reading the question properly?
Not sure. Scott, go ahead.
Can you see that? Can you see the question in the chat there?
Nope.
I don't, but I'll just say that you have a theory in the emergence of early Israel. It was either Martin Knopf, I believe it was Martin Knopf, who theorized that, or could have even been Wellenhausen, who first introduced the idea that Manasseh and even Ephraim and Manasseh had stayed behind. And so you always had indigenous Israelites in that area. And that when there was some exodus from Egypt, and when these people came back from Egypt, they reunited with Ephraim and Manasseh, who were there. And that's when the text says that alien and citizen alike joined in together, that's what they're referring to. I don't know how widely accepted that is today. I don't personally believe that, but that could be what this person is referring to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Dolores Testerman says, have you seen the new inscriptions in Ezekiel Tunnel? Proof of biblical kings of Israel, Judah, deciphered on Jerusalem rock inscriptions. I see smiles.
Oh, she just asked a loaded question.
A loaded question. Okay.
Okay, it's a loaded question. I should say that the clearest inscription that I have seen is what was found in 1880. Yeah, it's the so-called Siloam inscription, which has been at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul ever since then. This is a very clear inscription in which the workmen who dug the tunnel actually describe how they did it. Then there was another part of an inscription discovered by Roni
Okay,
Reich.
pause 1 second. Peter, you're saying that the workmen made the inscription? So it wasn't an inscription? Okay, so it was
it's not a royal inscription. It's not a royal inscription. It's the workmen who describe how they did it, how they met each other in the middle by cutting the tunnel. Yeah. The other inscription, which is a royal...
So that's very interesting. That's interesting because what we're saying is that workmen were literate.
Yeah. That is for sure. Yeah. The other inscription, which seems to be a royal, it's very fragmentary. We have only a few letters, and it's an inscription that was found by Roni Reich and Elisha Kron in, I think it was 2008. It has only part of the name, but it likely reads Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, and it refers to the pool and this is about where the inscription was found, near the Gihan Pool. This likely is indeed part of a roll inscription, but it's very fragmentary. I published on that in 2009. Now it's been picked up by Gershon Galil and Eli Shukron. I think this is a royal inscription. Now, some more recent stuff has been seen on the cliff wall. Some very vague pictures have been shown. Quite honestly, quite frankly, I could not see much there at all. But I think, to be frank, to the people who worked on this, we need to wait until this material has been published, and then we can make up our minds. But that what was shown, I must admit that I did not see much. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know if we lost Scott visually or if you're there at all, Scott. But we're going to wrap it up here with. Okay, we don't have your camera for the moment. At least I don't, but maybe you're there. The question we have is, on this report, as we wrap it up, how long does it normally take for the reports to be, reviewed?
My experience, and that's all I can go from, is 1 to 4 months. And so we're 3.5 months into the peer review process right now. So in my experience, I've never had it go beyond 4 months, but this could be an exception to that. Is that about what you've experienced, Peter?
Yeah. It's very different. I quite honestly, I've some stuff in press in the final. The final publication on Ramat Rachel. I actually joined the excavation at Ramat Rachel. I thought it had disappeared into the bin. After 15 years or so, I was contacted by the team, and that they are now ready to go to press. So anything is possible. I hope this will not happen to our technical article.
Okay, that's the longest I've ever heard. It must have fallen behind a desk or something, Peter.
Yeah.
Because for it to have taken 15 years for it to be.
I think that is an extreme case, because what happened is I think they brought the excavation to a close in 2012. Then the same team under the lead of Oded Lipschitz, they continued with an excavation at Atzeka. And so they concentrated on that. And now only since about 5 years, they start publishing the final results of that excavation. And I just simply had not heard back from them. But, things like that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if once again, what Peter and Scott are doing is really, really important. And once again, they need support for their work. And Scott, with the people in your particular case, they would contact Associates for Biblical Research.
That's right. They can contact ABR, and we would be very grateful for their help. As people might imagine, when you're doing this type of scientific technical work, and there's a lot of soft cost and hard costs that go with it. So we would be grateful.
Okay, and it's right there in the chat there. You can see biblicalarchaeology.org support ABR. That's where you can learn about that. And also, Peter, you've got this book. Both of you've got books, and we need to get some of those books in the bookstore here. But Peter, tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay. The book that came out this year was through Masthof Press in Pennsylvania. It's co-authored by my colleague Uwe Zerbst and me. It deals with the archaeology, the socio-political background of the patriarchs. It deals a lot with the book of Genesis and Exodus, the Israelites in Egypt. It's called In Search of the Biblical Patriarchs, an archaeological quest. It's a book that really takes you on a detailed journey into the time of the earliest Israelites, looking for evidence, looking at the descriptions, the political and sociological circumstances in the book of Genesis. It looks at the different sites that are mentioned. We're looking at when were these towns inhabited? Does it make sense in terms of the time of the patriarchs? And we have a very positive conclusion then, despite some very critical thinking that has been espoused by a number of scholars, saying that nothing of the patriarchal descriptions in the Bible have anything to do with reality because they're just late inventions. Our conclusion is really that the biblical descriptions fit the period around 2000 BC remarkably well, so that the author really describes something that we can find archaeologically. So yes, I think it's an important book because very few scholars actually take the risk of publishing anything about the patriarchs because it's too long ago. People tend to think, well, it's legendary. We don't think it's legendary. We think it's historical. It's found in the Bible as the Word of God. But what we find there fits the pattern of what we are having around that time in archaeology, in inscriptions from Mesopotamia, from Egypt, and so forth. It fits remarkably well. Yes.
Peter, I'd like to say this, if it's possible, let's look at that as a future some type of a patterns of evidence investigation, and get behind that because it's in a vacuum, right? There's nothing. I don't think there's anything there. So I think I really appreciate you guys for what you're doing, the commitment you've made. And in closing, let's just give people some encouragement. What this Mount Ebal inscription means. It's a big idea. So you guys have 60 seconds each to kind of give us the what this means and why you are so excited and really blessed because not many people get an opportunity like a discovery like this.
From my perspective, the discovery is important on an archaeological level because it helps clarify when Israel comes into the land. And on a personal level, from a faith perspective, I think it is important because it says to me that the Bible is a reliable historical source, that it can be trusted in detail. And if that's the case, when people like me are making decisions about eternity based on that book, then that's, of course, very encouraging on a personal level. So important academically, but also important personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we must say that here we have clear evidence of Israelite script at a very early age. And the Bible claims to have, also the early books of the Bible, including Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Number, and Deuteronomy, claim to have been written. Moses wrote down the words of God. This has been questioned over and over again. Here we find very clear evidence that Levites in Israel were able to write at an early stage. So if this is written word of God in the Bible, then it has much more power than if it took the Israelites about 1,000 years through oral tradition to finally write something down about something they had completely lost track of because 1,000 years would have separated them from what happened. It shows that people were able to write these things down, which makes a very good case for a very reliable biblical text, which we have in front of us. Yeah.
Well, and for me as an investigative filmmaker, it is an amazing pattern of evidence. And I think that the scientific approach, we've heard for the last century that the Bible, isn't what it was thought to be, and lots of criticism, higher criticism, everything. And these criticisms are being met with evidence. And I think that the pattern of evidence is so powerful. if you can look at it and just understand that God is acting in history. And that's what I think is exciting. There's so many patterns. I mean, the challenge I have, I'm working today because there's just so much work to do to put these patterns together. But they're there, and they confirm and encourage us that God's word is true and faithful. I know that we can't prove everything, but there's an enormous pattern, and this is an act of faith for many of us too. I believe that this is, they call it faith, right? And so anyway, with that, I wish everyone a Merry Christmas, and for those of our Jewish friends, Happy Hanukkah. And we are blessed to be able to do this type of work, and we're looking forward to this coming year with more stuff that's coming on. I'm working on Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2, and we're hoping to have that cut. There's other projects that are coming in the door and other things that we're working on. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Peter. You guys have a great weekend, and we are continuing to keep on thinking is what we're saying. So, all right. That's it for everyone. God bless you all.
God bless you. Have a great Christmas time and blessings for the new year. Yeah.